Marcus had faced gunfire, explosions, and the horrors of war, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that made his chest ache. Rex, his loyal Belgian Malinois, leaned against his wheelchair, his warm body a steady anchor in the storm. Marcus's medals glinted under the harsh lights, but they felt hollow now. The military had given him those medals, and now they wanted to take the one thing that had truly saved him: Rex. To everyone else, Rex was just another military working dog, but to Marcus, he was family. Marcus's jaw tightened as the judge addressed him, reminding him that this might be his last opportunity to speak. The military had decided Rex was to be reassigned, deemed government property needed for another mission. After years of risking their lives together, the thought of losing Rex now felt like a brutal betrayal. Marcus's hands trembled as he adjusted his grip on the leash, his voice barely steady as he began to speak. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his tone raw with emotion, "Rex isn't just a military asset. He saved my life in ways no one here could ever understand. On the field, he pulled me from danger, shielded me from gunfire, and warned me of traps before I could see them. And when I came home, when I couldn't even face myself in the mirror, Rex was there. He gave me a reason to keep going. Please, don't take him from me." The room remained silent, the air heavy with unspoken sympathy. Some spectators wiped tears from their eyes, while others exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions a mix of pity and anger. The judge's face remained neutral, his eyes studying Marcus for a long moment before he leaned forward, preparing to deliver his ruling. But before the judge could speak, something unexpected happened. Rex stood abruptly, yanking the leash free from Marcus's trembling hands. The dog moved toward the judge, barking sharply, his voice echoing through the courtroom. The crowd gasped and the bailiff stepped forward instinctively, though Rex showed no signs of aggression. His barks were insistent, purposeful, as if he were trying to communicate something urgent. "Rex," Marcus called, his voice breaking with panic. But deep down, he knew. He had seen this behavior before, countless times on the battlefield. Rex wasn't just barking, he was alerting them. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. "What's wrong with the dog?" someone whispered from the back row. Marcus's chest tightened as he wheeled himself forward, his voice trembling. "He's not just barking. He only does this when there's danger. He's trying to warn us about something." The judge froze, his gavel forgotten in his hand, his eyes locked on Rex. The room fell silent again, except for the dog's barks echoing like a heartbeat. Whatever Rex sensed, it wasn't just about Marcus. The dog knew something no one else did, and for the first time that day, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't just a goodbye. Something bigger was about to unfold, and Rex was determined to make them all see it. The metallic clang echoed again, sharper and closer this time, like an alarm ringing in the depths of the hallway. The tension in the courtroom snapped tighter, the weight of the unknown pressing down on everyone present. Rex barked ferociously, his body straining against the leash as though his sheer will could push through the doorway and confront whatever was out there. Marcus gripped the leash tightly, his knuckles white, his pulse racing in his ears. He could feel it now too. Something was wrong. Something was coming. The larger bailiff stepped fully into the hallway, his gun drawn and his eyes scanning the dimly lit corridor. His partner followed cautiously, flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. The beam cut through the darkness, but the hallway appeared empty, silent and still. Yet Rex's barking didn't waver, his growls growing deeper, more insistent. Marcus's instincts screamed at him to act, to shout for an evacuation, but he could already see the fear paralyzing the room. No one was moving. "Do you see anything?" the judge called out, his voice cracking as he leaned forward in his seat. The gavel trembled slightly in his hand, and his usual air of authority was replaced with an unmistakable edge of fear. The larger bailiff glanced over his shoulder, his face pale and glistening with sweat. "Nothing yet," he said, his voice low but tight, as if he were afraid that speaking too loudly would provoke whatever might be lurking. "But it doesn't feel right." He took another step forward, the weight of his boots echoing down the hall. The spectators in the courtroom whispered nervously, some clutching their belongings, others inching toward the exits. The uneasy energy in the room was spreading like wildfire. Marcus wheeled himself forward slightly, his eyes locked on Rex, who had gone silent again. The dog's ears were rigid, his body motionless, his eyes still fixed on the open doorway. "Rex is locked onto something," Marcus said, his voice trembling. "I don't know what it is, but it's there." And then, just as the bailiff reached the halfway point in the hallway, a shadow moved. It was brief, barely perceptible, but it was enough to make the smaller bailiff stumble backward, his flashlight beam jerking wildly. "There!" he shouted, his voice filled with panic. The larger bailiff froze, his gun snapping up, aimed at the darkness. Rex erupted into barking again, lunging so hard against his leash that Marcus's grip nearly gave out. "Back up!" Marcus shouted, his voice echoing in the courtroom. "Get out of there!" The judge slammed his gavel, trying to regain order, but the sound was swallowed by the growing chaos. People were rising from their seats, murmurs turning to shouts as the panic spread. And then, from the darkness of the hallway, came another sound, a heavy, deliberate footstep. It wasn't hurried, it wasn't rushed, it was calm. And it was getting closer. Rex's barking turned into a snarl, his teeth bared as his body pushed forward with unrelenting force. Marcus felt his chest tighten as dread flooded his body. Whatever was in that hallway wasn't in a hurry. It wasn't hiding, it was coming straight for them, and it wanted to be seen. The heavy footstep echoed louder than the courtroom could bear, cutting through the growing chaos like a blade. Rex's snarls filled the air, his body pulling against the leash with such force that Marcus had to anchor himself in his wheelchair to keep from being yanked forward. The tension was suffocating now. Every pair of eyes locked on the dark hallway, the source of the sound that no one wanted to face. "Everyone, stay calm," the judge shouted, slamming his gavel again. But the command fell on deaf ears. People were rising from their seats, clutching their bags, their hands, anything they could find, as if holding on to something would save them from the unknown threat. The larger bailiff stood frozen in the hallway, his gun raised and aimed into the darkness. His partner remained behind him, the flashlight beam darting nervously across the walls, catching every shadow but revealing nothing concrete. Marcus's voice broke through the mounting noise. "Get out of there," he shouted, his tone sharp and urgent. "Whatever it is, it's not safe." His words cut like a knife, but the larger bailiff didn't move. Instead, he squinted into the dim corridor, his jaw tight, and then the shadow moved again. This time it was unmistakable, slow, deliberate, purposeful. The smaller bailiff gasped audibly, his flashlight shaking in his trembling hand. "There's someone there," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The light caught something for a fraction of a second, a silhouette, tall and looming. It disappeared almost as quickly as it had appeared, retreating back into the darkness. But it was enough to send a wave of fear rippling through the room. The larger bailiff tightened his grip on his weapon, his voice steady but low. "Show yourself," he barked, his tone commanding. "Step out where I can see you." But the only response was silence, thick, oppressive silence that seemed to stretch for an eternity. Rex's barking reached a fever pitch, his teeth bared as his body coiled like a spring, ready to lunge. And then it happened. The figure stepped into the light, slowly, calmly, almost unnervingly so. It was a man, his face obscured by a hood, his hands tucked into the pockets of a heavy coat. His movements were deliberate, his posture oddly relaxed despite the chaos he'd caused. He stopped just at the edge of the flashlight's beam, his head tilted slightly as if amused by the scene in front of him. Rex's growling turned feral, his claws scraping the floor as Marcus strained to hold him back. "Who are you?" the larger bailiff demanded, his gun locked on the figure. The man didn't answer. Instead, he took another slow step forward, the faintest hint of a smirk visible beneath the shadow of his hood. Marcus's breath caught in his chest as an overwhelming sense of dread washed over him. Something about the man felt wrong, not just threatening, but deeply, fundamentally wrong. The man raised his hands slowly, the motion causing both bailiffs to tense and grip their weapons tighter. "Relax," the man said, his voice low, calm, and chillingly confident. "I'm not here to hurt anyone." But the way he spoke, the way his words lingered in the air, only made the room feel colder. Marcus knew immediately, this man was lying, and Rex knew it too. The room fell into a stunned silence as the man stood at the edge of the hallway, his figure partially illuminated by the unsteady beam of the flashlight. Rex's growls were now constant, low and guttural, vibrating through the tense courtroom. The bailiffs held their weapons firm, their hands trembling despite their years of training. Marcus's heart hammered in his chest as he stared at the stranger. The man's posture was too calm, too deliberate, as if he thrived on the unease he was creating. "Step forward slowly," the larger bailiff ordered, his voice tight with authority, though a hint of fear seeped into his tone. The man tilted his head slightly, his face still obscured by the hood, and then took one step closer. His boots clicked softly against the tiled floor. He moved with an unsettling confidence, each movement slow and calculated, as though he were savoring every second of the attention now fixated on him. Rex barked furiously, lunging forward against his leash, his claws scraping the floor. Marcus struggled to hold him back, his palms slick with sweat as his grip tightened. "Rex knows," Marcus muttered under his breath, his voice trembling. "He can sense it. He knows something's not right." His words weren't loud enough to reach the crowd, but the judge glanced at him briefly, his expression a mixture of fear and confusion. The smaller bailiff stepped forward, flashlight in one hand and his other hovering near his holster. "Sir," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "identify yourself now." The man finally lifted his head, his face partially visible beneath the shadow of his hood. His eyes were sharp, cold, and piercing, holding an intensity that sent a chill down Marcus's spine. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," the man repeated, his voice calm yet unnervingly hollow. He reached into his pocket slowly, causing both bailiffs to stiffen and raise their weapons further. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, and someone in the back whispered, "He's got something." The room felt ready to erupt, the tension a fragile thread that could snap at any moment. Marcus's instincts screamed at him to act, but he was frozen, gripping Rex's leash as if it were the only thing anchoring him to the moment. The stranger's hand emerged from his pocket, holding something small and metallic. The bailiff shouted in unison, "Drop it!" The man froze, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "Relax," he said smoothly, holding the object up. It glinted in the dim light, revealing itself to be a simple key. But Marcus's unease only deepened. There was no relief in the air, no sense of safety. Rex's barking didn't falter, his focus locked on the man as if the key was nothing but a distraction. Marcus's grip on the leash tightened as he whispered to himself, "It's not what it looks like. He's hiding something. He has to be." The man's smile widened, as if he could hear Marcus's thoughts, and the dread in the room became suffocating. The room felt like it was on the verge of imploding. All eyes were locked on the man holding the key, his smirk a sharp contrast to the panic spreading through the courtroom. Rex's barking was relentless, his growls deep and guttural, as if trying to sound an alarm no one could ignore. Marcus's hands trembled as he tightened his grip on the leash, his chest heaving with the weight of his instincts screaming louder than the chaos around him. Something wasn't right. This man wasn't just a threat. He was the tip of something much larger, much darker. "Drop the key and back away," the larger bailiff barked again, his weapon still trained on the man. The smaller bailiff edged closer, flashlight steady but his face pale with unease. The man, seemingly unfazed by the guns pointed at him, tilted his head slightly, his gaze flickering toward Rex. "That dog," he said, his voice low and almost conversational. "He's special, isn't he? Always knows things before they happen. That's what makes him so valuable." His tone was calm, but the weight of his words sent a ripple of dread through the room. Marcus's stomach dropped. How did this man know about Rex? About his abilities? His instincts? The hair on the back of Marcus's neck stood on end as he forced himself to speak. "How do you know that?" he demanded, his voice sharp and shaking in equal measure. Rex barked even louder, lunging forward against the leash as if trying to protect Marcus from something only he could see. The man's smirk grew, his eyes glinting with something sinister. The stranger slowly raised the key, his movements deliberate, almost taunting. "You'll find out soon enough," he said, his voice chilling in its certainty. And then, with a sharp metallic click, he turned the key in his hand. The sound was subtle, but its effect was immediate. Rex erupted into a frenzy, barking louder than ever. And before anyone could react, the lights in the courtroom flickered violently. A moment of pure darkness swept through the room, and in the black void, Marcus could hear gasps, shouts, and the scrape of chairs as people scrambled in fear. When the lights flickered back on, the stranger was no longer alone. Behind him, emerging from the hallway like shadows come to life, were two more figures. Their faces were obscured, but their movements were deliberate, their presence radiating menace. Both were holding weapons, sharp, metallic shapes that caught the light just enough to make their purpose clear. The two figures behind the stranger remained still, their presence looming but no longer advancing. It was a standoff, one that seemed to stretch on endlessly. The judge, breaking the heavy silence, cleared his throat and spoke with all the authority he could muster. "You've disrupted a court of law. This ends now. Bailiffs, escort these men out of here." His voice trembled slightly, but it was enough to reignite the tension. The bailiffs, regaining their composure, stepped forward cautiously. Rex let out another sharp bark. His teeth bared as his eyes followed every move the strangers made. The stranger raised a hand slowly, signaling his companions to stop. His expression shifted, not anger, but something closer to resignation. "This isn't over," he said calmly, his voice carrying an ominous weight. "You think this is just about the dog, but it's much bigger than that. You'll see soon enough." He took a step back, his smirk returning, but there was no warmth in it, only a cold, calculating confidence. "For now, I'll leave, but he belongs to us, Marcus, and we'll be back." Marcus's chest tightened, his grip on Rex's leash never loosening. "He belongs to no one but me," he said firmly, his voice steady and clear. "And whatever it is you're after, you'll have to go through both of us." His words struck like steel, and for the first time, the stranger faltered. His eyes narrowed as if assessing Marcus one final time. Then, without another word, he turned, motioning for his companions to follow him. The tension in the room didn't ease until they had disappeared through the same doors they had entered from. The silence that followed was deafening. Spectators slowly returned to their seats, whispers rippling through the crowd as they tried to make sense of what had just happened. The judge exhaled deeply, setting his gavel down with a shaking hand. "This court is adjourned," he said wearily, his voice barely audible over the murmurs. But Marcus remained where he was, his eyes still fixed on the door. Rex finally sat down, his growls fading, though his body remained alert. Marcus reached down, his hand gently brushing over the dog's head. "You did good, buddy," he whispered, his voice heavy with gratitude and exhaustion. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Marcus stayed behind, his thoughts racing. He didn't know who that man was or why they wanted Rex, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. But for now, as Rex leaned against his leg, Marcus let himself feel the quiet relief of this moment. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. Because no matter what happened, their bond was unbreakable, and that was something no one could take away. The days that followed were a blur. Marcus and Rex returned to their small apartment, but the encounter in the courtroom lingered in Marcus's mind like a shadow. He couldn't shake the feeling that the stranger's words were more than just a threat. They were a promise. Rex, too, seemed on edge, his ears perking at every unfamiliar sound, his body tense even during moments of rest. Marcus spent hours researching, trying to piece together who the stranger might be and why he was so fixated on Rex. He reached out to old military contacts, but no one had answers. It was as if the man and his companions had vanished into thin air. One evening, as Marcus sat at his desk, Rex suddenly stood, his ears twitching. The dog let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on the window. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He wheeled himself over, peering through the blinds. The street below was quiet, bathed in the orange glow of the streetlights. But then he saw it, a figure standing in the shadows, barely visible. The man from the courtroom. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He grabbed his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed the number of a trusted friend from his unit. "It's me," he said when the call connected. "I need your help. They're back." Rex's growls grew louder, his body rigid as he stared at the window. Marcus knew they couldn't stay here. They needed to move, to disappear. But where could they go? And for how long? As he packed a bag with the essentials, Marcus glanced at Rex. The dog's eyes met his, filled with a quiet determination. They had been through hell together, and they would face this too. Whatever was coming, They would face it side by side. The knock on the door came just as Marcus was zipping up the bag. Rex barked sharply, his body coiled like a spring. Marcus's heart pounded as he wheeled himself to the door, his hand hovering over the handle. He took a deep breath, then opened it. Standing there was not the stranger, but a woman, someone Marcus hadn't seen in years. Her face was serious, her eyes filled with urgency. "Marcus," she said, her voice low, "we need to talk about Rex." Marcus's mind raced. Who was she? How did she know about Rex? And why now? Before he could ask, she stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "There's something you need to know," she said, her tone grave. "Rex isn't just a military dog. He's part of something bigger, something dangerous. And if they get their hands on him, it won't just be your life at risk. It'll be everyone's." Marcus stared at her, his chest tightening. "What are you talking about?" She hesitated, then pulled a small device from her pocket. It was a holographic projector. With a flick of her wrist, an image appeared in the air, a blueprint of some kind, with Rex's name and a series of codes Marcus didn't understand. Rex was part of an experimental program, she explained. One that gave him abilities far beyond what any normal dog should have. He can sense things, danger, threats, even things that haven't happened yet. And some people will stop at nothing to control that power. Marcus's mind reeled. He looked at Rex, who was still growling softly, his eyes locked on the woman. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because you're the only one who can protect him," she said. "And because if they get him, it won't just be about you or him. It'll be about everyone." The weight of her words settled over Marcus like a heavy blanket. He had always known Rex was special, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman leaned in, her eyes intense. "You run, you hide, and you fight if you have to. But whatever you do, don't let them take him." Marcus nodded, his resolve hardening. He looked at Rex, who was now sitting calmly by his side, as if waiting for his next command. "We'll figure this out," he said, more to himself than to the woman. Together. As she left, Marcus closed the door, his mind racing with plans. They couldn't stay here. They needed to disappear, to find a place where no one could find them. But even as he began to map out their next steps, he knew one thing for certain. No matter what happened, he would protect Rex. Because Rex wasn't just a dog. He was family, and family was worth fighting for. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with danger and unknowns. But as Marcus packed their belongings and prepared to leave, he felt a strange sense of calm. They had faced impossible odds before and come out the other side. This time would be no different. As they stepped out into the night, Rex by his side, Marcus took one last look at the apartment that had been their home. It wasn't much, but it had been theirs. Now it was time to move forward. Into the unknown, into the danger, into whatever lay ahead. Because no matter what, they would face it together. And that was all that mattered.